Integrating racial and social equity in our work, I think, is a conversation that should be constantly held, especially among civic and community leaders. It's not just something that, you step into and then you start doing the work and you stop thinking about it. I think it's actually important to just sit down and ask ourselves these questions, because racial and economic justice are actually major barriers to why youth themselves engage in the system or don't engage with the system at all. So we have to be very mindful of these things, when we're creating space for young people.
Racism really robs us of living out our full human potential, and we have to be just as intentional in breaking down those barriers created to exclude us. So I sit in a space like many other BIPOC individuals where I hope to dedicate the rest of my life to ensuring that no one gets left behind. Black people are often told we have to wait for justice, and what folks don't understand is that wait holds an immeasurable amount of pain and loss. And I hope to align my life's and community building work with racial and economic justice, because I do realize how important it is. And this work transcends borders. This work is important for all of us. And it's not just work that Black and Indigenous communities have to do, but it's work that we all have to do.
There's the sentence that say, politicians don't listen because youth don't talk. Well, youth don't talk and politicians don't listen, right? There's the little circle there. But it's also because youth are going through so much and they don't feel like participating with the system because there are so many barriers already. And these conditions are themselves barriers to any participation in democracy. And so the cycle of apathy actually just starts with not feeling seen, not feeling heard, and also having to struggle with all of these things that young people are going through every single day.
But those are survival mechanisms in the margins of a formal system who's not welcoming you. So all those are kinds of engagement strategies that young people find, and it depends very much on your context, in what situations. How do you deal with a professor who is racist in the school? How do you respond? All those things it's young people engaging the system.
Time is a huge barrier that I've seen with a lot of young people, whether it's do they choose to work that part-time job or whether they have caregiving or familial responsibilities, and there's a cost to that. Time is a luxury. I think that's something it's important to remember, but an important one that I've been seeing a lot in my social circles this year is the emotional cost of this work, especially on mental health, and constantly having to prove your humanity or demand basic human rights is very emotionally taxing, and it leads to burnout, it leads to mental health challenges, and there's not a lot of support for youth in those ways.
Right now, there is a very interesting, the world is not equally distributed. The demographics are not, consistent across the world. You have Africa right now where youth are excruciating majority. That is going to create some interesting change across the continent, where, 70% of people are under the age of 75, more or less, depending on the country. And a system that is so rigid and so old and occupied by much older population, I think we're gonna see a lot of change happening all over.
I realized that the Sustainable Development Goals help to shape, in a way, what a manifesto of an international youth movement could look like. You mentioned economic justice, and I just want to say very short, profound thought that I have. In this moment right now, today is Wednesday, 7th of October 2020. It is to a reasonable extent difficult to try and project what the next 200 years will look like. Anthropologists and sociologists have been able to figure out and tell us and share these stories with us. And so it's a way to tell myself and anybody that I talk to that the world will not always look like this.
I totally agree with both Mohamed and Jude on this, that I think we need all kinds of strategies and tactics to accomplish the things that are necessary, right, for us to have a more just and sustainable world. I think it's helpful to think about these things as tactics and strategies rather than as identities, which I think sometimes people get a little bit wrapped up in the idea of like, okay, this person's an insider and that person's an outsider. And I think it's actually more useful to stop and say like, okay, what are the things that are going to help us accomplish the things that we want in this moment? What's the right strategic choice? Does it make sense to participate in my local city council? Or is there no way that they're actually going to hear this point in that context? And we should spend more time and energy working from the outside. I think one of the dangers sometimes is that people can end up thinking that they have to be sort of entirely internal to a space or participating in a space, and they can spend a lot of time not actually making progress in that space.
If we go down to the real definition of what a social network is and remove the popular technology platforms that we currently have from that definition, right? Maybe then social network can help to advance this kind of courses or this kind of goals that we have. Now, what do I mean? Facebook is a social network platform, but it's the platform, right? There can be other kinds of social network that we can develop that is maybe less technology, but a network of young people across the entire continent leveraging on the kind of followership that we have, right? To be able to build demand and pressure on government for what we want to achieve.
Talking about some of your current work in research and activism, and potentially your answer to this question, is democracy at risk?
I think the answer is obviously yes, and that is evidenced by the fact that really for the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen in net terms a recession of freedom and democracy in the world. We have fewer democracies now than we've had at any time since, the Big Bang of democratic explosion in the early 1990s as a result of the demise of communism in Central and Eastern Europe and what's been called the Second Liberation in Africa. And, as I've written, and Yascha and others, these have been happening incrementally, gradually accumulating more and more power through an authoritarian playbook that is increasingly being replicated in what we thought were fairly sturdy and robust democracies, where I think our democratic norms and practices have come under severe pressure by Donald Trump, who represents a unique threat in the annals of American history to our fundamental democratic practices.
There's something that could institutionalize that in the long term and thus create the grassroots movement, which is still in us, that community-centered approach, that could create the capacity for transparency, anti-corruption, and democracy to thrive. And one of the things that I really try to emphasize every time I speak is that the anti-corruption discourse cannot become the anti-politics discourse. And that's very important because corruption has been eroding the pillars of democracy, and young people are not approaching politics anymore, especially in the traditional sense. Political party, union, and affiliation is going down in terms of youth because they feel this corruption is almost inherent to politics.
One of the concerning things, though, is that young people aren't always as invested in democracy as we would like. I would love if there'd be more brave 17-year-olds protesting against corruption. But it turns out that actually, in many countries, young people give less importance to living in democracy and are more open to autocratic alternatives to democracy than older people, and that's something that's very worrying. My sometime co-author Roberto Fora is just releasing a report that shows another quite worrying and shocking fact, which is that actually young people's satisfaction of democracy tends to improve when populists get elected. And it tends to improve both in countries where left-wing populists win, but it also, with the one interesting exception of the United States, tends to improve when right-wing populists win. So young people tend to be more left-wing, and so the left always thinks, well, look, since the young people are left-wing, over time we're going to win, so we just have to wait. And I know certainly in Europe, the left fought that in the 50s and 60s, and then fought in the 80s and 90s, and they think it today, but somehow the moment when the left wins every election never arrives. For a number of reasons, including the fact that young people turn out to become more conservative as they age. I think in the United States, there's a demographic version of this, where there's this really strong compelling idea of a rising demographic majority, which motivates people both on the right of a political spectrum and on the left of a political spectrum. So I think a lot of the sort of conservatives who embraced Trump were motivated by this idea that this is really the last chance to defend the country before all these minorities who are all left-wing are going to take over, and then our vision of America is going to go down the drains or something like that.
We grew up in a generation that got used to this instant gratification. Technology could always bring things to us this fast, right?
Think back the consequence of violent struggle and how that caused miserable experience for everyone, how that make us suffer, right? So I think young people, when they kind of think back in the past that violence yield no positive outcome in their own countries, then they kind of realize maybe non-violence is a way. That's another point. And I think the other one is that I think more and more young people rely on decentralized or even horizontal structure of organizing. I think there are a lot of advantages of that, but the downside is that it's very difficult to retain nonviolent discipline when you have different groups working autonomously, although under the same umbrella movement, right? And so you have no control. You have no agreement whether or not you would use violence or non-violence. And I think we see that in the US right now, correct me if I'm wrong, the movement structure is so decentralized that no one, even with one group who wants to retain nonviolent discipline, they can not convince the other group to use nonviolence like them.
Sadly, democracy is not like a switch. You can't just turn it on. Ironically, when it's turned off, it's really difficult to get it back on.
Democracy is not universal, and perhaps the desire for democracy is not quite as universal as we would like. But I think the disdain and the hatred of dictatorship is. And wherever people come to feel the lack of their freedoms, there is always a movement in part of a population to rebel against it.